I don't really know how to follow them. When we were coming up the stairs, I noticed there was a Albert Einstein quote on the wall, and it just reminded me of another quote from him, where he said, "A human being who experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings as something separate from the rest is in a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature." And I was just thinking about that. I mean, when you look at what's happening, for example, in the news today, and and how we see different issues and how we see things as being not connected. And it's not just in the news. I mean, look at how NGOs are structured. We have environmental NGOs, we have NGOs that work on poverty, other people who work on health. We look at our newspapers, they have sections on these are environmental stuff here, and we're going to have health and well-being over there, we'll have politics over here. Everything, of course, is very, very separated. And when the elites meet and they talk, they separate those things. The World Economic Forum, which is the get-together of the elites who on a mountain at the top in Switzerland. When they just before they meet, they issue what are the global challenges? And it was interesting what they said were the global challenges. The first three global challenges that they said were extreme weather, climate policy failure, and natural disasters. And the fact that they could even separate those three, it just astounded me. And I think it's really important for us to remember how everything is connected. When we think, for example, of where we are now in this moment in British society, we think, for example, how did we get here? We can go all the way back, and of course, it's really important we think about, how we got here was because of the history of colonialism and the history of imperialism. It was a history of empire. But even in the last sort of decade or so, when we think, for example, of the financial crisis, you think, what was the financial crisis? A bunch of people were bankers who decided that they were going to turn housing into an asset, into a derivative, and they were going to trade it, and they gambled on it, and when they gambled on it, it failed, and then it sparked this global panic, and then we ended up in the worst recession since the 1930s, and it sparked what? It sparked a decade of austerity, where we now have 1 in 4 children living in poverty. We've just had such a dismantling of society just in these last 10 years. It's incredible. We have about 1 million people now working on 0-hour contracts. We have people living in extreme poverty. The levels of inequality back to Victorian times. 1.5 million people using food banks in the 5th or the 6th richest country in the world. It is absolutely incredible how everything is connected. And of course, I would argue probably we won't be in the situation we are now with about Brexit if it hadn't been for austerity and the feeling of alienation and neglect that so many people felt, and the anger that came from that. And of course, that's a story not just of Britain, but it's a story of around the world, right? Of global inequality. We're in a moment where 26 people owned as much wealth as half of the world's population. And about 70% of the world still now, despite the fact that our economy grows and grows and grows, still live in poverty. 3.5 billion people live on less than $5 a day at the moment. Denied the very basics of what we would call a dignified life, not extravagant, but the right to, for example, to health or education, barely surviving. We have a system where we produce enough food to feed the world 3 times over, and yet we're burying 1/3 of all the food we produce back into the ground, while nearly a billion people face hunger. We have a world of just such an extreme inequality, and of course, and I would argue that that's a structural reason, right? There's a structural reason for that, and that goes again back down through history, right? There are people who are being sacrificed. This is the sacrifice zone of neoliberalism. And it's important because, you may have seen today in the newspapers, there was the 2 reports that came out. One was a report by the IPPR, and it was interesting because, 5 minutes. It was interesting because there was a report. It just said everything's connected. You're like, Duh. Of course it is. And why does this report need to tell us that everything is connected? But it was quite shocking, the fact that people thought it was really, it was major news that, you connected the fact that we're now living, in the 20 warmest years since 1850 have happened in the last 22 years, that now we're having, an extinction rate, for example, of our species, unprecedented. The last time we went through this kind of extinction rate, was about 5 billion years ago, and that was, as a result of extremes like the volcano and the ice age. This is a human-made extinction. It is absolutely quite incredible. And there was another report you may have seen that about the insects. What is the connections between things? And that's what's driven my politics. I've been involved in lots of global social justice movements and very radical movements here in the 70s and 80s, fighting for the right of our communities to live free from attack from racist violence and skinhead gangs and the National Front, right through to militant industrial struggles, to the anti-war movement, to the anti-globalisation movement, and now to the climate movement. And I always say to people, and Roger again, because we work together at Friends of the Earth, I always say I'm a reluctant environmentalist. I didn't come to the environment because I came to because of the environment. I came to it because I understood that this was the place where all of the issues were connected together, and this was important for us to bring those perspectives together. And the reason why we're failing in terms of the environment movement is because we reproduced what neoliberalism did. It separated the environment from people. What is the image of the environment, of climate change? The white polar bear on the white iceberg. It was something that actually was alienated from most people. When people talked about climate change, they talked about it in such technical terms that most of us felt it was nothing to do with us, or we had no power in it. Or if we had power, what was it? It was to consume very differently. It wasn't that we had power to change this system that we were living in. And as somebody, who works a lot with the global movements, I have to say, in all for me, well-being, and I really do think it's very, very important. It's interesting, I think, of self-care and well-being, because I see it now like it's a lot like the language of intersectionality, right? It's a new word, and oh wow, and people are really excited about it, and you go, oh, well, that's just race, class, gender. That's what we used to say in the 70s and 80s, and all of these words, yes, they're new, but actually the behind them, the values and principles and the strategy go back through eons, because they're a fundamental part of not just of us as individual human beings, but they've been a fundamental part of how we have struggled and how lots of people still struggle. Like, people say to me, don't you get totally depressed, you work on all these miserable things, blah 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 blah, and I say, actually I don't, because I'm grateful, and I that I have an opportunity to work with movements in the global south, and when they talk, they don't talk about individuals, they talk about as communities. As a community we're organising, as a community we're resisting, and they talk and they have this incredible self-care and love. You can step back, absolutely, you are nurtured, you are, nobody wants anybody to be burnt out, but there's also a recognition that their strength comes from us becoming, collectively, taking action together. And I think that's really, really important, because otherwise a lot of self-care, and I look around and you think, self-care is just another excuse for being selfish, right? If self-care is only about preserving yourself, then that is about your power and privilege, right? That you can step out, that you can say, okay, I think the world's going to shit, but I'm just going to look after myself. And ironically, it's no better than what the far right is saying, because the far right's narrative is literally an expression of that, right? What is walls and fences? What is the narrative of walls and fences? It's about creating the other. Don't care about them. Yeah, they're dying and drowning in the Mediterranean. Don't think about them. Think about you. It's only you. You should only care about you and your family, the people who you love. That is a deliberate attempt to break the connection between us as human beings, and that's been a very, very important thing. So I, just on the interest of the fact that everybody said really brilliant quotes, I'm going to quote you one of my favourite activists, which is Emma Goldman, because I'm being told to shut up, who was a Russian anarchist, and she said, today is the parent of tomorrow. That is the law of the individual, that is the law of life, the individual, and the revolution. Revolution that divests its ethical values, thereby lays the foundation of injustice, deceit, and oppression for the future society. The means we use to prepare this future becomes its cornerstone. And I think, for me, that is a very, very important message. So I'm going to end by quoting my last great Muhammad Ali, because I think, not only as somebody who actually epitomised all of that about the well-being of care and about seeing himself as more than just an individual. His famous point was, we.